Welcome, everyone. My name is Marianne Ormond. I'm a director here on the company network at Ceres, and we're so pleased to have you all here today for today's webinar, using the power of data to reduce environmental risk in your environmental supply chain in China. I'm joined by a powerhouse group of women today to share this topic with you, and it's an important one for all of us here at Ceres. As many of you probably know, Ceres has been working on social and environmental issues since for 30 years, and we've been working with all of our partners in the investor, corporate, and advocacy space in really trying to build a sustainable economy for people and our planet. And as we're here in the year 2020, it feels just more critical than ever that we all come together and address the increasing need for us to solve global challenges in this critical decade ahead. And I think perhaps one area where that's been a real challenge, but also a real opportunity, is in the supply chains of global companies. As companies try to become more sustainable in the way they're handling their own operations, it has become clear that there are impacts that many of us don't even see, that are far down in the supply chain and span all over the globe. And as we're headed into this new decade, innovation is a key part of how we might be able to just understand and address and mitigate those impacts and risks. One partner that Ceres has been really excited to work with is IPE, working out of China and doing some incredibly powerful and innovative work to be able to help companies understand and mitigate those impacts. And we're so pleased today to be able to share the stage with Linda Greer, who is a senior global fellow working at IPE. She's going to take over in a moment and start sharing with you the tools that IPE has offered. And then in addition, we have two esteemed colleagues, Sandra Durrant from Target and Brennan from Dell, whose companies have been really using these tools in an effective way to manage their supply chain risks. And they can share what their experiences have been in using these tools on this very complicated topic. So I think without further ado, I will hand things over to Linda. Let me see, I'm going to be relying on Linda to let me know if I'm at the right slide for you.
Hi there, so I don't have the slide deck on my screen yet. I don't know if others do.
Okay, great. We'll handle that technical difficulty in just a moment. Thank you for that. But Linda, as that gets sorted out, I think on our tech side, it would be just terrific, I think, to hear a little bit from you, just kind of broad overview as we get the slides moving along.
Sure.
From the IPE perspective.
Sure, I'll sort of give a brief introduction to what I'm going to do in the slideshow, which I was planning to do in any case, and we don't really need the slides for that. So what I'm planning to do with our hour today is give everybody, now I'm there, thank you. I'm going to give everyone a brief introduction to IPE, sort of what the organization does, and their theories of change for their thinking behind the methods that they use to try to improve environmental conditions in China. I'll then jump right into a description of IPE's supply chain oversight system, which is comprised of a massive database and a set of search tools to assist companies in finding the information that they need. Information transparency is a key cornerstone of IPE's efforts. So we'll cover a little bit of the most relevant transparency work with regards to corporate supply chains. And then after a few slides on the results to give a glimpse of how much this work is really helping to reduce pollution in China, I'll give the participants a look at what does this really look like, what companies are actively participating, and sort of the dynamic cadence of the work on a daily and weekly basis over at the IPE offices. We'll close with some comments on how this system can fit into corporate overall supply chain systems. So helping people to imagine how the system will help them directly. And then, of course, I'll call upon Target and Dell, who I want to thank again for giving us a little bit of their time, because both companies have been really leading participants in our program. And, I think they'll have a lot to say. Before diving into the next slides, let me tell you that I will happily supply this whole deck to you. So the participants need not be taking massive detailed notes on any facts and figures on any slides. And my hope in doing this is that some of you will want to try this out. I'll provide you my email address at the end of the presentation, and I'm hoping that you will get in touch afterwards. We also are able to give this whole presentation in Chinese to your Chinese teams, which might be something helpful for you. And we have a few fact sheets that provide more information on request, if anything, a few of the key topics that I'll be covering. So I'm ready for the next slide. So IPE was founded in 2006. It's a relatively young organization, founded to address rising concerns for pollution in China. And its underlying driver is to use public information to drive improvement in the environment. Next slide. There are sort of three underlying pillars for the way that IPE works. And they're the power of law, the power of people, and what I call the power of the purse, which includes work on both sourcing and procurement that we'll focus on today. Also includes some interesting work in green investment that we can talk about another day. But let me give a quick kind of run around the wheel before diving more deeply into the power of the purse. Next slide. IPE is quite involved in overseeing and tracking both the development of new laws in China in the central government, and particularly then in assessing the performance of provincial governments in implementing those laws. They put out an annual performance scorecard for local officials, which has become quite a competition across different cities in the and provinces in the country, and has been very successful in promoting additional inspections, enforcements, and transparency. Next slide. And they have done a very good job in tracking the numbers of inspections, enforcements, and results of those enforcements in terms of business disruption, to try to keep that front and center to help companies know what's going on in terms of suspensions and those sorts of things. Next slide. In terms of power of the people, the way I see this work is sort of both a give and a take. So in terms of what they give to the public is they have an amazing app called the Blue Map app. These are 3 screenshots from the app, which supply people ambient pollution, air pollution, and water pollution readings for where they live. Provide some indications of, the first one is air, the second one is water, and then also provides indications of factories that are out of compliance in those same areas. Over 3.5 million people have downloaded this app. A lot of people use it like a weather forecast to determine what the air pollution readings is in the city that day, decide about whether they need to wear masks, and also have forewarning as to whether or not their school systems might be closed. Next slide, please. In terms of the take, so to speak, IPE also has an enormous program collecting information from the public, asking them to submit photos about pollution problems with a geolocate on their own map, and also deploying the public into overseeing local conditions. They have a team like River Watchers that we have here in the United States, and do a number of public inspections on the ground. My favorite program that they have is a citizen audit program for supervising compliance audits. I don't have time to go into that in the presentation, but I'll be happy to take questions about that in the end if we have extra time. Next slide. But now we're going to dive into the corporate supply chain oversight tool that following under that power of the purse, since that's really the key focus of today's webinar. And the members of this audience, this is really where you guys are in play. So there are three components of the corporate supply chain oversight system. One is the database that I mentioned earlier. This is it's called the Blue Map database. It has 1.6 million non-compliance records. That is not an error in commas and decimal points, which I initially thought that it was when I heard how many there were. There are roughly an estimated 6 million factories in China. So that gives you a sense of the scale of information that is tracked in the database, and any publicly disclosed non-violation records are captured by IPE and put into the database. In addition to that, the database contains real-time monitoring data from about 18 of the largest factories in China. These are factories that have been required by the government to do real-time monitoring of their water discharges and air stack discharges. And on this map, you can see 2 hours ago what the situation was for various parameters in the permits of those 18,000 factories. It's quite a mind blower, I promise you. And then the third component is what we call the brand map, which transparently identifies the suppliers to certain major brands on the map. And I'll show you a bit about each of these again in the coming slides. Next slide, please. So the database is updated hourly. It pulls from roughly 3,000 sources from all 31 provinces in the country and 337 cities. You might be interested to know that IPE just created a coronavirus map with the same idea behind it of collecting that data from the local sources, the local government sources, and putting it onto the map. Next slide. This shows you how rapidly the records have increased in the database. At the beginning of time, you can see that we had only a very small number of non-compliance records, but as the government became more and more active in its inspections and more invested in transparency as a tool they themselves were prepared to use to drive responsibility and accountability, we were presented with more and more non-compliance records to absorb into our database. Next slide. The type of information that is in there, I mean, first of all, what I've been talking about, the violation records and the real-time emissions data. In addition to that, though, we log officially confirmed petitions and complaints when the public reports on a problem, and that is officially logged by a government office. We also log a very important component, which is enterprise feedback, when companies are asked to explain what their problems are, what they are doing, and upload documents to verify their corrective actions. We have a section on beyond compliance data, which is data that is voluntarily provided by factories, often at the request of their buyers and brands, which includes public release and transfer information, similar to what Europe requires, as well as water and energy use data, and then general environmental quality information that may just be available for areas around the factories, such as their soil quality data. Next slide, please. This shows, so that's what's in the database itself. Please, not so many clicks. Back. Yeah, thank you. This shows you what the real-time monitoring map looks like when you open it up. This is a monitoring map of one parameter, which, if I remember correctly, might be ammonia. The number at every circle is a factory of the 18,000 factories. You can spread this map open like a Google map and get closer and closer. If the number is in a blue circle, it was in compliance with its permit 2 hours ago. And if that number is in red, the factory was out of compliance. Next click shows you an example of clicking on one of the circles that shows you, oops, I was wrong, it was COD, that shows you that this example facility had a high COD ranking 2 hours ago. Next click. You can then see what its standard actually was and how high above the standard it was. In this case, it's 800 and something, higher than 200. Next click. You can also then see 30-day or even 60-day trends so that you can establish for yourself whether this is just one aberrant reading, maybe something not to worry about so much, or whether you have a situation of chronic noncompliance, which in this case we see is the case. The red bars are red when it's out of compliance, and we see that in this example, this facility was in chronic noncompliance for the month in question that I looked for in this example. Next slide. This is the green supply chain map that I mentioned in terms of transparency. We have 15 companies now who have put themselves on the map. Their logos are sitting on top of a facility that was one of the facilities that you saw on the previous map. What is going on behind the scenes here basically is that these companies are saying to those factories, your environmental performance is going to reflect on my corporate concern about environmental matters. So please get on top of your problems, and if you screw up, let us help you. And this is a way that that companies that are already publicizing some of their supply chain factories, which by the way is a trend that we see more and more, can more directly link those lists to environmental performance. And we do have a number of companies that are in the pipeline preparing to come onto our green supply chain map in 2020. Next, please. Just a little bit more about then how you would use this database. Down at the bottom, you see the box that says Enterprise Environmental Data. You could basically search by a factory name, which by the way, as long as you have that factory name in Chinese, you can do after this webinar without any further pomp and circumstance. It's more convenient if you want to do batch searches of a supply chain. There is a way for you to register an account at IPE and then search the full batch whenever you hit a button. And we are happy to sign an NDA if you feel that your supply chain list is still a confidential matter. And this is a way that you could do a routine batch search using an IPE account. Next slide. I wanted to note that factories also use the database when they're responding to problems. So they issue public explanations of violations in our system. When violations are discovered, we ask companies to ask their supplier to issue that public explanation within 10 days. And in that explanation, they would describe their rectification plans and then update it over time. IPE does verify the activities that are reported via a document review and occasional on-site reviews with third-party audits. So this is in essence a service that we provide to help you to verify that the factory is becoming more accountable for its pollution problem. We like to be in partnership with you because your point of leverage with these factories is sort of more potent than ours, but we recognize that we are a team of environmental professionals that can help you with that oversight and that additional push. And by the way, all of everything I'm describing today and those services are free of charge. We are not a consulting firm. We are a nonprofit environmental NGO, and we receive our funding from philanthropic foundations, both inside of China and internationally. Next slide. One very cool feature of our work is a tool that we developed last year called Blue EcoChain. This is also on the Linda Greer hit list of favorites, just in case you're keeping track. This is called Blue EcoChain, and basically automates the job of checking your suppliers for their compliance status. So rather than requiring you to press a button and do a batch search every week, every month, every 6 months, whatever you chose to do, this basically makes the search a continuous function. And when a new record comes into our system, be that either a non-compliance record or one of those real-time data problems, you will receive a push notification on your cell phone or in your email that alerts you to the violation record. What's cool about this is that your supplier is also notified. So they know that you know. Everybody is on notice that something has happened that requires a response. This is where the clock begins in terms of the 10-day request to post an explanation. And we keep track as to whether or not those explanations have been posted with the actions to follow. This tool has really ratcheted up the amount of oversight and accountability that we are experiencing at IPE. It has made a huge difference in the amount of work coming our way, which we are delighted to have. I'll show you some of those figures in a minute, but suffice it to say that we had to actually hire a few more people. We were, in essence, at the end of last year, running a call center for factories that had been notified that they needed to do something about their pollution problems, which is exactly the kind of problem that we were hoping to have. Next slide. So this shows you what's been going on. We now have more than 10,000 factories accountable in our system with their explanations and information releases, and those numbers are going up, up, up every year. Next slide. And just, just on that previous slide, that is sort of my slide to show you how valuable this has been to helping us to reduce environmental problems in China. So that's sort of what we are getting out of it. And then next is sort of what you guys are getting out of it. This is just sort of a typical week. I cast the net. We had more than 20 brands pushing more than 100 factories to take corrective action for their pollution problems, or sometimes to give public information beyond compliance, because some of our most proactive companies are pushing their suppliers to provide information on water use, energy use, and other things. And so the push in some cases is a push sort of to address a negative situation, but in other cases is actually to ask these factories to distinguish themselves as model corporate citizens and start to provide this beyond compliance information. So the next slide is just to give you a sense of this, what this looks like. These next several slides, you can kind of check this out on real time by going to our website. Up in the upper right-hand corner, you can see what happened yesterday in the same front, but I just picked a typical week in 2019. So one click, please. This shows you what information we put publicly. In this case, the example, Primark, the name of the company, pushed a type of factory in a certain location to do a certain thing. Next click is similar, just to give you the idea. Nike pushing a printing factory to issue an explanation about a solid waste problem. Next click, and then next slide. And next slide. So this is just to give you an idea that what we try to do is give a pretty good sense of what's going on out there and where it's going on. We like to give recognition to the companies that are doing the work. Sometimes we have companies that are actually very active but do not want to be named for a certain reason, either because they think the factory they pushed, people will all know that that's their supplier, they're not up for that, or because they just don't want people to know that they've been this active just recently, and we're happy to have that as well. And we just call them then an anonymous brand, as you see here, pushing a certain factory, type of factory in a certain place to issue a certain explanation or whatever. Sometimes you'll see that the announcement is that they're conducting an audit. Sometimes they're going beyond compliance. It really all depends upon what the push was about. And we give that flavor in this sort of one sentence summary. Next slide, please. The benefits to the brands that are participating. Why are they doing this work with us? First and foremost is for assessing legal compliance. As most of you have, these companies have codes of conduct that they wish to implement. These require suppliers to comply with local environmental laws. This is a very good way to do this in the country of China. I think some of them are also really interested in this as a tool for better brand protection. It'd be much better for the brands to find out about poor supplier performance right away when it first happens, then find out about it on the front page of the Wall Street Journal or from a Greenpeace report or some other very negative way to have that information come out. So this gives a great opportunity to constructively engage with that supplier, to in some cases help that supplier know what to do, and to protect your own reputation that would otherwise be threatened. It's of course an opportunity for great environmental leadership, like we have featuring for Target and Dell, who, as I mentioned earlier, are really outstanding participants here, really leading the way on what this tool can really do to help them. And for that part of your companies that are not so environmentally focused, but are actually very worried about reliable supply chains, this tool is very helpful to get ahead of those government enforcement orders that might suspend production or even close a factory down, which China does more and more. It can help you protect against unexpected production disruptions and help your factory, your supplier, keep itself from getting into such hot water with the regulatory officials if they can get ahead of this problem quickly enough. Next slide. This is just a slide that gives a greater sort of framing for what I imagine is most of your company's green supply chain efforts. You have a screening component, which we have covered how this would work. I imagine you then have an enforcement component where you're trying to get environmental performance up to speed. To the extent that you have disclosure interests or even requirements, it certainly works at that. And then it also allows you to expand beyond basic compliance into looking to energy and water use and reducing particular hazardous chemical uses and releases. So this is just a little splash of, the various sort of keywords of components of your supply chain system and how I think that the IP system can be helpful to you. Next slide. This is my final slide. This is a new tool that we are developed particularly for financial institutions. We're calling it Blue Map for Business, and it has been developed to help banks and investment companies screen the environmental performance of either entities asking them for loans or as they try to put together their investment portfolios. The name of the game here is to help them deter investment in polluting entities. And this is just being rolled out by a large domestic bank in China who is giving it a pilot this month and then intends to use it for tens of thousands of factories in 2020. The interesting thing about the Blue Map for Business is that we are providing the financial institutions with summary risk assessment scores that we call a DECRA score that basically is based on an AI review of the corporate noncompliance records so that the banks are not required to read all those records and set priorities. They can just get a 4-color risk ranking system. I have a fact sheet about this. I wasn't sure how many financial institutions were going to be on our call, but I'm happy to provide a little bit more information on that following the webinar. And this is a work in progress and one that we would definitely welcome participants in joining with us in the coming months as we continue to refine it, mature it, and put it together. I think that's my last slide. So my thank you slide, which is the next slide. Next slide, please. Provides my email. To reiterate, although there are more participants on this webinar than I could have possibly imagined, nonetheless, it is my hope to spark all of you to contact me at this email and tell me you'd like to give this a try. One thing companies often do is work with us with 10 or 20 factory names, and we help you. We have a team. I have a team in China. We help you to upload those factories and see what you learn, and then help you to interpret what you learn in just that little trial. And for those of you just curious to learn more, we have an English edition of our website, and there is the website address. You can go on there and click around and find quite a bit of additional information about both the supply chain oversight work as well as other things that IPE is doing and annual reports and other oversight reports that they have done over the years. And that's it for me.
Linda, thank you so much for just a really valuable and informative presentation. I know we're going to turn to our other speakers, but I did want to just make a quick announcement to the participants that there is in your control panel for the webinar a chat function, and we would welcome you to submit questions you may have, either for Linda or for our upcoming speakers. So just wanted to call that out because we should have time at the end for answering some of those. Thanks.
Okay, and then I'll call on Sandra Durrant, who I have worked with for many years, and from Target, and ask Sandra if she might be willing to give us a little bit of her direct experience with working with IPE, and then that we'll follow with Susan.
Thank you, Linda. Hello, everyone. This is Sandra Durrant with Target. I wanted to share how we've been working with IPE over the last, I would say, 8 years as they've really grown as an entity. We use it in a variety of ways, and I'll really touch on probably 3 of the biggest ways we use it. First and foremost, we use it as we are onboarding or vetting new suppliers to come onto our matrix. IPE is one of our first go-to screening tools to ensure that as we are adding new suppliers to our matrix, that they are operating in accordance with local laws, which helps us really understand the mindset of those suppliers to ensure we're onboarding suppliers that are like-minded from an environmental perspective. We also, like Linda talked about, like her favorite hit list, the blue eco chain push notification. This is something that Target loves. We do have a large supply chain, and so you know, it can be daunting to go in and search for all of your suppliers. And so what we have done is through that blue eco chain push notification, uploaded our matrix. And so now our team in Shanghai will then get an email notification if we have a factory that is operating outside of compliance. This actually is really great because, as we all know, if you're working on audits are only giving you one moment in time. And so we're able to really just deploy resources in the right way and allocate resources to where are those biggest risks and those biggest needs. And I would say the third way we really use IPE is for that bigger picture data. So like Linda said, the IPE database is open to all. And over the last 3 years, as we've really been building our environmental compliance program, we've really used the IPE database to understand what are the biggest compliance issues in China, both within our matrix and just holistic total China, so that we could really prioritize training and education on capability building for those issues within our supply chain. But then we could also really get better understanding and analysis on where could there be the biggest risks or disruptions in our supply chain, so that we are ensuring that we're focused in either the right regions or the right types of supply chains to manage our resources the right way as we work on capability building within our supply chain. So I'll pause right there, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat. But I will say it is one of the easiest databases to kind of search, especially if you use that blue eco chain push notification, because then you're just letting the tool do the work for you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sandra. That was wonderful. I really appreciate that. I'm sure people got a lot out of the specifics of how you guys have been using it. And now I'll turn to Susan.
Thank you, Linda, and Ceres team. It's great to be with you all today to talk about how Dell is working with IPE and implementing the Blue Map tool in our own supply chain. So my kind of talking points today very similar to what Sandra just walked through as well. Dell has been a longtime partner with IPE, and we utilize the Blue Map tool to help us track and mitigate environmental risks in our supply chain. So Dell, like many technology companies, has a pretty significant footprint in China in terms of our supply chain operations. So with Blue Map and through our relationship with IPE, we're able to pretty closely monitor our suppliers' operations in the country. So we receive the notifications and then are able to quickly remediate any environmental issues before they become a much more significant event to our operations. So as we continue to see environmental regulations increasing in strength and as well as just kind of the oversight on them, we view this tool as a way for us to ensure that suppliers are compliant to local regulations, and then ultimately, like Linda mentioned, and ensure suppliers are maintaining that compliance rate and aren't at risk for significant fines or factory shutdowns that would pose a supply chain operations issue for us. Also, it does protect the local community, and it also protects Dell's brand reputation and mitigates those supply chain risks. So Dell right now is currently using the tool for that monitoring and the mitigating of environmental violations through both Blue Map and the EcoChain push notifications, which Sandra did a phenomenal job really emphasizing the power that has. We're monitoring our direct material suppliers through the tool, and then because of that, our supply chain environmental health and safety specialists are able to quickly get in touch with the factory within 24 hours of us receiving that notification that there's been any kind of violation. We'll then go in and get additional details about the issue. We'll work with the factory to troubleshoot and remediate the violation, and ultimately just ensure that a situation doesn't escalate or get any worse. Again, it helps us just to build that resilient supply chain and ensure that we don't see any halting of operations, as well as maintaining that strong community engagement and ensuring that our factories are able to continue to operate where we need them to. So a good example of this, in the last 2.5 years, we worked with a supplier very specifically on a wastewater discharge issue. So supplier was found in 2017 to have a sewage discharge situation. And to remedy the issue, the supplier actually built their own on-site wastewater treatment plant, but they didn't go through the permitting process. And it was an issue Dell otherwise wouldn't have identified, but it came to us through Blue Map and through this relationship with IPE. And once we realized that this wastewater treatment plant wasn't properly permitted, we were able to quickly engage with that supplier to ensure that that was a situation that was addressed. We were able to do some capability building with them and ultimately get that wastewater treatment plant properly permitted without seeing any supply chain downtime because of it, as well as ensure that the wastewater treatment plant was doing everything it needed to do to protect the local community. So it, like I said, just kind of continues to maintain that relationship. Right now we're working with our ODMs and final assembly suppliers to help them track this and carry it into their supply chain as well. So really diving in a little bit deeper into our sub-tier. In 2019, we worked with key suppliers to get more than 20 waste vendors and raw material suppliers who are not directly contracted through Dell, but deeper into our sub-tier to engage with IPE and start to report through the Blue Map tool and be monitored there. So it was really exciting just to see this, not just with our direct material suppliers, but the impact of it as it transfers down into our supply chain. And then the last piece of how Dell is working with IPE and using this goes back to that data analysis piece, which I think Sandra talked about a little bit as well. We've been able to organize workshops and roundtables for suppliers and allocate resources specifically based off of the types of issues that are coming to our attention through Blue Map. So again, it's something where we're able to address those areas of non-compliance. We use this information as part of our risk assessment process with suppliers as we figure out, like we said, where we'll need trainings, where we may need additional auditing, as well as then this informs our supplier scorecarding process. So when we're going into quarterly business reviews with suppliers or evaluating their performance within sustainability, the information we are getting through IPE is a key component in the environmental section of that score. And as we've mentioned throughout this, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, send them our way, and happy to respond and address.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was also just fantastic and sort of surfaced an issue that I wanted to just emphasize. I should have mentioned probably in my own, which is, you know, we see the environmental impacts of supply chains usually beyond that tier 1. You know, if tier 1 is just assembly or cut and sew or something, those facilities do not usually show up in our database because they're not usually the ones with impact. And so it is those material suppliers, you know, across most industrial sectors, that is where the action is. And, you know, both you guys, Dell and Target, have done a really good job in identifying those material suppliers and then focusing those efforts where those hotspots lie. So thank you for sort of raising that and surfacing that as a key component of the impact of the work that you are doing. And I think I'm going to hand this now over to Ceres, to Marianne, to cope with any questions and discussion. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, thank you so much, Linda and Sandra and Susie. It's just really helpful to be able to hear about the tool itself, but then really the many benefits it sounds like it has brought for each of your companies. And, you know, for those who are on the line today and listening and wondering how to get started, I wonder maybe if each of you could just say a little bit about how did this all start? It sounds like you've used the tool quite effectively across several different kind of business functions and processes, but did it start off with just understanding that you might have had some risks that you weren't really able to get insight into, or you know, did you hear about the tool first and then build it from there? It would just be great to kind of know how things began as you got ready to leverage it as effectively as you are today. And that could be either Susie or Sandra for sure.
I can take that, Marianne. So in our case, I believe we've been working with IPE for a long time, but then also recognized that this was a risk for us. And as we learned more about the Blue Map tool, transitioned into using it. So it was more of we identified a risk. We knew that there were, you know, potential environmental regulations that we just didn't have a great handle on in our supply chain, and went down the path of pursuing the use of this tool. And then, as Linda mentioned during her presentation, the move over to using the push notifications through EcoChain was really kind of an easy sell, just given it is a lot of factories that we're monitoring, and the idea that we could get IP to do a little bit of the work for us with that push notification really was a pretty easy sell on our part.
This is Sandra, and I will say our situation is a little similar to what Susie was talking about, where probably about 2010, we really started having more strategic relationships with our tier 2 suppliers. And as we started engaging them directly, we also started to ensure that environmental compliance was adhered to. And that's really where we came across IPE and their database of, you know, how can we work smarter or not harder, and utilize data that's already been gathered for us. When you're, you know, either just starting to work on environmental compliance, or you have a smaller team that is trying to tackle a lot. And so this has been really meaningful for us. And I will say, you know, just as Dell talked about, we actually introduced, over the last 2 years, have been really introducing IPE to our tier 1 suppliers so that they're monitoring their tier beyond tiers compliance, so that they can really ensure that they don't have that product disruption, as China is really taking a harsher hand on compliance violations, which we've seen be happening over the last 3 years.
And then this is Linda. I'll just add that from IPE's vantage point, we probably 10 years ago began to look across all the different types of violations that were coming in, looking at what sectors had problems, looking for leadership companies, multinational corporations within those sectors, and approaching companies to help to take action on suppliers. It's never easy for us to know which factories are suppliers to who, but sometimes we do know that for whatever reason. Sometimes it's even posted on that factory's website. And so we have had a proactive program of trying to recruit companies to come in, you know, with a full range of success. Everything from companies not getting back to us at all to companies that just jump on this because it's sort of exactly what they were looking for and they didn't know about IPE. So we have been, I tried to be quite proactive in finding companies that want to join into the program.
Great, thank you, Linda. I think also, you know, it's exciting to hear how companies are becoming more proactive in using this data and really doing more analysis, like you were mentioning, Sandra, of just you know, going beyond just understanding where some of the compliance issues are to using it more proactively. And I wonder too, as each of you has been working with the data a little bit more, if there are other teams internally that you have shared this information with, or how it might be used across the organization as you're continuing to take those proactive steps.
So this is Sandra. We are utilizing it into our supplier scorecards for our sourcing teams, where they're then able to see that compliance data against their overall performance. It has been influential on which suppliers we want to grow versus slower maintain. Which has been, I will say, you know, 8 years ago, it was new and novel to be, you know, integrating that into their scorecard, where now our sourcing teams are really asking for more of that data to ensure that they're making the right decisions in placements.
Great, thanks so much for that. And I think we'll encourage anyone who is on the line and would like to ask additional questions to just type those in now. And if there are any final thoughts that any of our speakers want to share as we wrap up today's webinar. Linda, I don't know if you have any final advice for anybody who is thinking about reaching out, or any lessons learned that would be helpful for folks that are exploring the potential of these tools.
I guess my only final observation is based on experience. I want to encourage learning by doing. You know, I've experienced a lot of companies spending a lot of time thinking theoretically whether this might be interesting and useful to them. and having a lot of discussions about it. But honestly, I think the way to get quickest to yes or no is to kind of try it and see what the information is like, and then start to imagine how would you use that internally? You know, how would that fold into either a supplier scorecard or some sort of program like Susan and Sandra were describing for, you know, being in touch with suppliers to avoid supply chain disruption, et cetera. So I guess my only observation is that the best way to really get the idea of what the system is like is to try it, because it is quite unique. I don't think there's anything like it elsewhere in the world. And that's probably the fastest way around, even if when you go around, you decide, you know, we're just actually not ready for this. I would just encourage people to give it a try and see what happens.
This is Sandra. I would just add that it's free. So there's no like sales gimmick here. The data is free, but the data is also coming from government databases. And so it's, in my opinion, it's just like this availability of kind of a neighborhood watch program, if you will, of, you know, the data is credible because it's coming from government databases and it's free, where, and I think Linda mentioned this before, it's not like you're paying IPE for consulting services. It is something you as your company needs to be self-motivated and drive. But with some of the features like the EcoChain push notification, it actually is very simple to use once you get that your initial matrix loaded into the system.
Great, thank you so much, Sandra. And any other thoughts or advice from you, Susan, from Dell's perspective? I know that you've performed quite well, I think, on just working through all of these tools to improve your performance there.
Yeah, I mean, again, just to provide some emphasis behind what Sandra said, it's a free tool and it dramatically reduces your environmental risk. It encourages suppliers to implement better environmental practices, to ultimately build better relationships with their communities where these factories are located. It's a lot of winning by using this tool, and I would definitely encourage others, if you have questions about it, please reach out to Linda. It is pretty intuitive to use, but and the more companies and the more brands that are using it and looking at this data, the more factories that we can encourage. It only makes this better for everyone involved.
Well said. Thank you. Yes, for that. I appreciate the encouragement from both of you. And I know, Linda, you were mentioning potentially if you did want to say a few more words about Blue Map for Business, and we do have a few more minutes to kind of share that a little bit more if you want to.
Yeah, sure. I'll give just a little thumbnail on that. So, you know, we recognize that when companies download the non-compliance records, there's a lot of reading to do. And it's one thing if you're just looking, you know, there's a big upfront problem of just when you first do it, and then you still have to read when new problems arise, you know, because you were notified in Blue EcoChain. Really, it's not. Most of our participating companies have not found this overwhelming, but on the other hand, they have responsible sourcing, green supply chain staff and programs. They have environmental professionals that are taking a look at some of this data. They have their China teams that are suited to do that. And so what the Blue Map for Business does is try to help sort of boil the records down to a risk score. And we've done that with an eye towards financial institutions that may have literally thousands and thousands of factories that they want to review, at least at the outset, for their investment decision making. So they're sort of at the beginning of, you know, they're in the starting gate for a large run ahead, and they may not have anyone on their staff who is able to interpret the level of severity of what they're reading. And so it is, it's sort of a deceptively simple in concept, where we have a AI tool that goes through the records looking for keywords about the level of noncompliance, the size of the penalty violation, the date of the records, whether or not there has been any rectification, whether there's been any public explanation, etc. And with that in hand, you know, through addition and multiplication, come up with a score and a 4-color rating system. Now, mind you, none of this means that at the end of the day, you don't have to read the records, but it could, for example, allow you to go from 10,000 factories to 2,000 factories or 1,000 factories to do more work if you were a large investment bank. And which factors to consider, how much weight to give them, et cetera, is all a matter of professional judgment and is something that we're making our best efforts at and then plan to be refining over time. But the new tool, which is in an app and also will be available over the web, basically allows for the facilities search that we talked about earlier, but then the results of that search is that risk score, the number and color, and then you can dive in. So then you could, you know, rank order based on score and sort of take it from the top. For us, we're just very excited about the new point of leverage of financial institutions. And whereas a lot of financial institutions do use various ESG screens, including, you know, the GRI screen that Ceres has been involved in and things like SASB and other screens, this one is pretty laser focused on these compliance issues, and we hope can be helpful that way. Since those are, you know, quite specific concerns that many companies and certainly many financial institutions have, whereas many of the other indices, ESG indices, are very broad, you know, things like other important fields, but are very broad, including things like governance, risk and crisis management, even in, you know, in policy influence in some cases that companies may be undertaking. So those indices, those ESG indices are, we see them as sort of like a complement, and this is a more specific tool that is largely compliance focused.
Great, fascinating. Well, we're so pleased to have all these tools available to everyone who is so focused on managing supply chain risks and impacts and becoming proactive in improving that performance. And I just want to say on behalf of Ceres, our sincere thanks to Linda, to Susan, to Sandra for sharing your insights and expertise with all of us. And thank you everyone who joined today. This webinar recording will be available on the Ceres website, and you can see on this slide contact information to reach out to Linda and learn more about IPE's tools as you're working to improve performance across the supply chain. Thank you everyone, and wishing you all a safe and healthy rest of the week.